I'm going to start again because I was muted. You got to love it. Hi, everybody. We're going to start again. My name is Khyati Joshi, and I am co-founder of the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice and professor of education at Fairleigh Dickinson University. My partner in justice, as I like to refer to her, is Shanelle Henry, also co-founder of IDSJ. We were together on Wednesday when we first heard about what had happened in Atlanta with the murder of 6 Asian American women, 2 other folks, and actually one person who is still in the hospital. And we decided to create an educational event to talk about topics and issues facing Asian Pacific Americans in general, as well as specifically do some discussion around school issues, curricula, teaching, in the classroom. Before I hand it over to Shanelle, I really do want to take the time and pronounce the names of the 6 Asian American women who were killed, so that hopefully we will do that and not just refer to the murders in Atlanta or the Asian American women, right? Because they had identities, they were people, they had their lives. So we really do this hoping that in some way we can honor Soon Chung Park, Hyun Chung Grant, maiden name is Kim, Sun Cha Kim, Young A Yu, Xiao Jae Tan, and Dao Yo Fang. Shanelle, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Khyati, and good evening, everyone. My name is Shanelle Henry. I am the co-founder of the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice with Khyati, and also the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Greens Farms Academy in Connecticut. This evening's panel will provide you with the historical and the current context surrounding anti-Asian racism, and specifically talk more about how to teach and talk about such related topics. I am glad to be joined this evening by our distinguished panelists, Dr. Liza Talusan and Dr. Judy You. And I will turn it over to each of them at this time to introduce themselves.
Great. Thanks so much, Shanelle, and thank you, Khyati, for the opportunity to be with you, and it's exciting to be reunited with Dr. Yu as well. So I'm Liza Talusan, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you virtually from just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, which is the ancestral and traditional land of the Massachusetts and the Wampanoag people, in addition to a number of tribal nations. And it's an honor to be here with you. We'll go into it a little bit. It's also a real struggle to be here today to talk about this work, but grateful to be here in community. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Yu so they can introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Judy You. I am a professor at Queens College, and I am also the founding director of REACH, which is a consulting organization based out in New York City that allows me to work with community-based organizations across the country. I've been very privileged to work with the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, as well as sitting on the commission planning board at CUNY for the first Black race ethnic studies commission. Historically, we at CUNY, we've been given $10 million. Our chancellor, Felix Matos Rodriguez, have dedicated $3 million for ethnic studies. So that is a statement to be made for all higher education institutions across the country. And I would like to state that to pay attention to that move, because funding does matter, and funding matters to where scholarship is being generated and how it's being generated. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you to Khyati and each of you for being here with us this evening. Our time is limited, so let's just dive right into the conversation. And I wanted to kind of open our conversation with a quote that I read recently in a magazine. And the quote says, "To live through this period as an Asian American is to feel trapped in an American tragedy while being denied the legitimacy of being an American." And I know Khyati and I talk about this a lot in the Summer Institute when we discuss, right, the history and law of who is an American, who was allowed to be an American. But I wanted to also open it up to get each of your thoughts on this and discuss a little bit how the present is rooted in our past. Anti-Asian racism is not new. So Judy, I'll actually go to you first.
So I think it's really important for us to think about who identifies the term American, right? How do we define American? Because in 1790, the U.S. Congress made a uniform rule of naturalization that any alien being a free white person can be a citizen. That does not include people of color, obviously. So that in a state has stated a preface of who belongs and who doesn't belong. I think historically, marginalization of people of color has always been rooted in legislation. So, for instance, the Page Act in 1875, it prohibited Asian women, Chinese women specifically, from entering into the country, right? And that paved the way to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the only legislation in American history that has barred any ethnic group from entry to the United States of America.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that we didn't learn in school is that anti-Asian racism is part of the social and legal infrastructure of this country. Judy talked about issues of citizenship and then the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can go further into the 1900s and then talk about what happened with the Immigration Act of 1917 and 1924, which really limited Asian immigration. And I've always thought that when I was in high school, if I could have learned this information, things would have made sense more. You know, I just always felt I was not part of this country, that my family came and we're new, and that's how it is. But when we connect the dots between what happened with state and local laws, and then what happened with Chinese Exclusion Act, and we fast forward to what happened to the Japanese and Japanese Americans with Executive Order 9066, which interned everyone into camps, Japanese and Japanese Americans, you can start seeing this thread that's been there. It's been there in terms of anti-Asian racism. We can take that further and we can see, fast forward to 9/11 and the way that South Asians were targeted afterwards. So this is there. When the former president talks about, you know, the Wuhan virus and the China virus, and then that stokes fear, all of that has been done before. All of that has been done before. And we need to teach that so that it makes sense for folks.
Thank you both. It just, you know, brings to mind when you say, you know, we need to teach this. And I've mentioned to Khyati and Liza before in terms of learning history, or really relearning history, right? As I relearn it as an adult and hear you talk about it, but also hear you tell your stories and making history personal. So I just think about, you know, the general population, right? I consider myself in that general population. What does the general population need to know about Asian Pacific America? You know, Khyati, we've known each other for a very long time. I value our friendship. You've taught me a lot about the intersectionality of race and religion, right? And the number of conversations we've had, and that bringing in the personal about your experience, particularly as a South Asian American woman. So I'll go to you first on this question. What's your response to what does the general population need to know about Asian Pacific America?
Well, Asian Pacific America, I mean, we are such a diverse group, right? And, you know, Asian American and Asian Pacific American, this is a social legal construction, right? Actually, if you think about the census, those of us who are from South Asia, we were actually not considered Asian until 1980. And so that should show you how this is a social, legal, political construction. And the other thing is while we have, you know, Asian Americans who've been in this country Actually, we can go back to the late 1700s when we had the Manila men coming from the Philippines entering via New Orleans, and then critical numbers arriving to the West Coast in 1840. We have, 6th, 7th generation Asian Americans here. We also have a large number that are immigrant and second and now third generation. And these folks, you don't realize you're racialized, right? A lot of times people are like, I'm Korean, or I'm Vietnamese, or I'm Indian. I'm not Asian, right? And the second and third generation come to understand that actually, we have commonalities across our differences. And that's one really important point. Also, we're talking about so much linguistic diversity, and we're talking about religious diversity. So, and a lot of times I'll end this with this and then throw it to Liza. Asian Americans aren't thought of as people of color. I have been asked by white folks and Black folks why I identify as a person of color, because there is this sense that Asians are white. And, we can talk a little bit more about that, why that is, but there is and part of those assumptions are able to happen because people don't know the history, right? And don't know the anti-Asian history. Liza, what would you say?
So, first of all, this question is so difficult to answer and also so easy, right? Which is like, what do we all need to know about Asian Pacific America? Which is, you can't possibly know it all, right? There's just so many different histories, journeys, presence, and then you start throwing in the intersection of religion and race and immigration and family. I mean, there's too much to even narrow it down. So part of my answer is understanding that people have heard this phrase over and over, right? That we're not a monolith, we're not one group. And yet, to Professor Joshi's point, we are also a really organized and unified space. When you think about the political movements of Asian Americans, we did actually group together for political capital to be able to move and organize together. And that was among a bunch of different racial, ethnic, historical experiences and differences, as they mentioned earlier. So I think for me, as I kind of lean into this space, and I'll speak from the perspective as a Filipino American, as an Asian American, there's actually aspects that I tend to experience in terms of not always feeling Asian enough. I don't speak my family's home language. I don't speak Tagalog. I know the swear words, but there's not like, I don't feel like I often have a lot of credibility in that space because I don't speak my home language. And then there's also aspects of when I was growing up, I didn't learn about my history. And it was actually what sparked a lot of my own research, understanding that so many of us who grew up in this country grew up with Asians as enemy, right? So whether it was internment or Pearl Harbor or the wars overseas, we were socialized to believe that I was an enemy of the state, despite the fact that I was born and raised in Boston. And so I think that's also part of the complicated understanding of who is and what is the Asian American Pacific American experience. And then also, just to complicate this before I throw it over to Dr. Yu, as we think about even just the very differences among Asian and Asian Americans and our family in the Pacific Islands, that they are actually very different historical contexts and experiences, most recently around recent kind of colonization. And so I think my big takeaway for all of you is it's a very complicated history, and so therefore approach the community from a very complex discourse. And I'll turn over to Dr. Yu if there's any couple of comments you want to add in your reflections there.
Yeah, so again, I echo what Liza has stated about how complex our identities are, because that's a really big question. I'm going to talk to you from my perspective as an immigrant. I wasn't born here. I'm an immigrant. I'm from a working class family. Through education, mobility, I am not, where I was before with my family. So it's different. And let's talk about the economic divide of Asian Americans, right? The women that were killed in Atlanta, they were working class immigrants, and some were undocumented. So we need to recognize the complexities of our identity, and America cannot put us in a box because we are diverse, we're complicated, we're multiracial, right? And it's something that we need to really think about in terms of having this discussion, because within our own community of Asian Americans, we have our own division, right? There will be times where we try to apply for grants at a cultural institution. Asian funders do not want to give us money because they say, please do not include that part of history, right? Because they're ashamed of it. Even though that is really part of the history. I didn't build the railroad, but that is part of my history, right? So, and it's important to reclaim it, because that shame has to do with colonization of education and whiteness. There is a desire for many Asian Americans to be white, right? So within this space, even in this space and the Facebook and the social media space, I know a lot of us are struggling to find our identity. And that's something that we have to come to grips with and to reckon with, because now we have mass shootings, we have hate crimes every day, people are dying, and this is serious. So I'm going to end it there.
Thank you, Judy and Liza and Khyati. And, I hear you and I see your passion. And there are folks in the comments who are echoing and amplifying exactly what you are saying, and also talking about their own intersectionality, right? So you talk about the complexity of the Asian community and desire to be white, and there are other types of folks of color who are also intersected with Asianness, right? There was someone in the comments who talked about the racism that they've encountered being Black and Asian. And so that's another, right, conversation. But all of it kind of broadens the mind and the work, especially as someone, who's in the field of education and diversity. We know that, and we've seen, and you touched on it, in the past year, Asian students in particular have been blamed, right, for spreading coronavirus and kind of scapegoated as the cause for everyone having to wear masks. Many of us have been in remote or hybrid or distance learning, but still feeling that target and being marginalized. So as teachers, as professors, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, directors, administrators of all kinds, we all have a responsibility to specifically address anti-AAPI racism with our students, particularly as part of our overall anti-bias work. So Judy, I'll come back to you. What are some key issues that educators and policymakers need to know regarding Asian Pacific America?
I mean, I think I said this before. I mean, this is like my 5th panel. I have to be very honest. And I know with the smiles, I know y'all have been doing a lot of panels, right? But we got to share this power. We can't be the only ones speaking out. And actually, we have a new Secretary of Education in the House, right? We need to talk to him. We need to really, the research is there. We have done over a century of research on culturally relevant pedagogy, critical scholarship, ethnic studies. All of us have done the work. We have presented at AERA over 50 times. We have flew in the country, out the country, everywhere around the globe, right? We have spent a lot of money. I am done with the funds, okay? We have to put the scholarship into policy. We know ethnic studies is American history. So let's just say that, right? I think the research, we have scholars in this room, we have scholars around the country, internationally. We don't need to have any more trauma to have another call, right? Because this is a pandemic of racism right now. And our children are watching us because they are watching to see what we're going to do. And it is up to our role as educators, as parents, as people to do something about it. So I think it's really important to recognize we have the data. And I said this before in another talk, right? Is that we have the data. Now look in the mirror. What is your conscience telling you to do? You got to change the policy today. The K through 12 education system right now is colonized. We know that, right? So we need the people, the policy people at the table to come to our table and sit together and figure it out. How can we integrate? We need professional development for our teachers. We need youth workshops. We need to train our professors. We need to train our superintendents. We need to train our principals. We also need to continue training ourselves. And I'll be very honest, I still need training. I don't know everything, right? So I think is work that is in motion, is organic, and everybody is held accountable. So I'm going to pass it on to my other colleague, Liza.
Great, thank you. Oh, you can tell Dr. Yu's been on panels all day.
My hair.
Like, I'm done. This is the 5th one today. So I actually am just coming. Yeah, I'm just coming from class. So I teach at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I teach a course on anti-racist leadership. And of course, and I too have been doing panels and workshops for the past couple of days, and this is where we've always started. So I'll speak about this from the education perspective. I saw a couple of comments come through, and I'll pick up on Michelle Shivani's comment earlier. As I think about what's happening in education, I mean, education is truly a toxic space, in particular for students of color, and the lack of critical discourse in our K-12 schools related to race is also detrimental to our white students. So what Michelle had noted there was, if we're going to teach Ellis Island, we also need to talk about the stories of Angel Island. And also, those aren't the only 2 immigration stories to this country. There's so many more. So when I think about education being a space that is erased critical discourse, and then when I acknowledge the pushback that many K-12 schools are experiencing that are attempting to lean into anti-racist work, or not even anti-racist, just truth-telling. Can we just call it truth-telling about education? The fact that I was only taught that I was an enemy of the state is a lie. And I went to a good public school, right? What someone would call it a good public, well-resourced, well-prepared teachers. And I was taught lies about my people. And then I became a college student who had to perpetuate that. And then when I think about my role as a teacher of school leaders, I continue to perpetuate that when I leave out Asian American discourse. So one of the things I'm really asking of our teachers to do is, my goodness, stop erasing us from the history of this country, stop erasing us from the activism and the policies. And that doesn't have to be at the expense of other communities of color. It is in collaboration. If you are talking about the civil rights movement, you have to teach about Asian American, Indigenous, Latinx, multiracial, and Black folks that were working together. By choosing to leave us out, you choose to inappropriately educate our youth. And so what I'm asking of educators is not only be inclusive, but tell the truth about history. If you don't happen to know it, and I don't fault you for that because you went to the same type of schools I did, then you have an adult responsibility to fix that as an educator. You have an adult responsibility to not replicate that same trauma for the next generation. So as teachers and as policymakers and as educators, you have to do the right thing and teach truth. Yeah. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Professor Joshi.
So formal, Liza. I want to give a call out to the parents who are watching tonight, because we need our Asian American families and parents also saying to the schools that we want this anti-bias education, that we need our history taught, that our students' experiences should be there when there are conversations on race. There's still too many conversations happening where it's predominantly working Black, white. And if it's convenient and we can have Hispanic folks or we can have Asian American folks, we will. And none of this is convenient, folks. None of this is convenient. It is hard work. It is hard work. But I think we, have to step it up. Judy mentioned how, there is a sense of folks immigrating to this country and, trying to assimilate. And that often has meant trying to become white. And I think we have to, and that happens because also folks don't know the history. We keep going back to history, but it explains so much. And I think that if we learn our histories, and then you want to know even more, and then you understand how we fit in. And it is particularly understanding the racial justice piece and working in collaboration with other parents of color, which is really, really needed. Sometimes I think, I've experienced sometimes in the past, Asian American parents don't always identify as in groups that are for parents of color, you know, and you are that, you are seen as that. This is your history, and we need you to get involved that way to advocate for ethnic studies and for social justice education.
Thank you all. We are getting a number of great comments that, you know, really add to the richness of this discussion, and also wanted to invite folks to put questions into the chats as well, because we are coming up shortly to our Q&A section where we get to include your voices, right, as we have been, but certainly address the questions that you have. We know we have many educators who have been chiming in, and, you know, also addressing the parents and other viewers as well. So if you have some specific questions for any of our panelists, or just generally, please go ahead and make sure you enter those. And our last topic for this evening, before we actually turn specifically to Q&A, is what is one recommendation? And you have been giving out many. If you had just one, specifically for schools, or as we think about curricula, someone just gave us a comment there about teaching thematically, history thematically as opposed to chronologically, right? So if you had a recommendation specifically for schools around revising curricula or otherwise, what might that be? And Liza, I'm going to come to you first, because I know you're someone whose career spans, right, positions in higher education and independent schools, and you're a career coach and consultant. You work with a number of folks specifically on curricula and schools. So as you think about your career and your span of your work, what is your top recommendation here?
Yeah, so thanks for that. The benefit of working kind of in a K-20 span is I get to see the areas of alignment and where they don't quite align. And so I have to say, given the K-20 span, unless you're kind of in undergrad and you're majoring in ethnic studies or Asian American studies, there really is a pervasive invisibility to our community. And so one recommendation I would make in terms of curricula is stop contributing to that erasure. We are everywhere, our histories, and not just one type of whatever that Asian monolith is that you're thinking about. There are multiple pathways into this conversation. Again, in the comment box, we heard someone starting with Angel Island, but you heard Khyati talk about the fact that Filipinos in this country were here hundreds of years ago. And so as we complicate the multiple immigration stories, there are absolutely touch points within your unit, within your K-12 curriculum in particular, where you can insert an Asian American narrative. Poets, artists, authors, right? Not just in traditional fields that we stereotypically think of in terms of STEM. I invite you to add in Asian American activists, right? Why was I a full-grown adult when I heard about Larry Itliong, right? Like, that's not the kind of education that we should be erasing for our children. Teach them about activism, help them see themselves in this work and in this world. And that, I think, is one of the most important jobs you can do as an educator, and also as a parent, a tita, an auntie, or a caregiver of young people.
Thank you, Liza. Khyati?
I work with teacher educators. I work out in schools and in the districts. And one of the things that keeps me, what I stay focused on, is I want folks to be able to bring their 100% to school, 100% of them to school. I want our Asian American teachers and administrators out there to be able to bring their full selves to school. And that's not happening right now. And one thing to think about is that when somebody can't bring their 100% authentic self, society is losing out. That school district is losing out. That school community is losing out. It really is. And, you know, I know what I experienced growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, not really fitting in, as I say, as a little brown Hindu girl. And I just think about, man, I could have made better grades. I could have been a happier person if I saw myself reflected in the curriculum. You know, and so thinking about curricula, making sure that Asian Americans are included, but really, you know, how do we reach those kids and make sure that they know that 100% of them is welcome at school, and they don't need to hide some things away, or our Asian American colleagues, right? They're not invisible. And that's often what I hear, that well, I say this, but I'm just invisible, because everybody thinks, there's no racism against Asian Americans. I've heard that over and over from teachers and what they've experienced. So I'm focused on, how do we as schools, as teacher educators, as communities, as parents, make sure that we can build a school community that allows everyone to be 100% their authentic self.
Thank you, Khyati. Judy.
I also think it's important to think about our community-based organizations and our museums and cultural institutions. Those rich sites are scholarship. They document untold stories of our grandmothers, grandfathers, people who didn't have the power to pen a story, right? So when we talk about stories and narratives, who really gets to tell the story? Who has the power to do that? Usually, it historically has been wealthy white men. And that's what we've been learning in schools. And because the tide is now changing, finally changing, that we are seeing more visibility of us representing and speaking out against it, there are resources. There's museums that we work with in New York City. I'm very lucky to be in Queens, where I work with students that are so diverse. I mean, Queens is an urban, like, mini world here. So for us, for the teachers in Queens and public schools, and also like surrounding Queens, like Long Island, Westchester, you just have to ask the students to write an autobiography, and there you go. You have the story of America, right? Whereas there are some parts of other states, right, in the Midwest, it may be more difficult. However, it doesn't mean that even if you have that one Asian American child, that you should not talk about their identity, right? Oftentimes they feel, teachers and school administrators feel, that we should cater to the majority, but then you're not really telling the full story. You're not being inclusive, and you're actually hurting the educational development of your students, because when they go to college, they're going to be in this culture shock that this is the first time they've met an Asian person. This is the first time they met a Black person. I hear that all the time. So the protection of, like, privilege that schools want to do to protect their students from this bubble is popping. It already popped. In fact, it's popping every day because of all this violence, right? So we have a responsibility as educators, as to Liza's point, tell the truth. It is our responsibility. And as parents too, we are responsible for raising the next generation of humans, of adults, and having that social responsibility is just as equally as important as getting good grades, getting a great job, and and it goes on and on. So where's the humanity? We need to really think about that. Where is our humanity in our educational system?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Judy. And you just touched on and echoed one of the main reasons why I left higher education and went into pre-K-12 education, right? Because I was working in diversity fields where I was encountering older students who did not have the skills, the language, the competency, the comfort in just engaging with someone different from themselves. And so, in interrogating that question, wondering what was missing in their education primarily, I went back, right, to find out. Let's look at the K-12 curricula to see what students we were sending into colleges, what was missing, how do we fill in those gaps? And that's a question, one of the questions in our Q&A here is specifically around pre-K, right? Early elementary grades. How do we talk about this? How do we teach? How do we fill in the gaps for pre-K, kindergarten, early elementary students, their curricula around AAPI education? And I'll open that to either of you.
Judy, I think you should start that one.
Yeah, so I actually did do a pre-K Asian American, Chinese American history course at the Museum of Chinese and Americas. I actually did a Head Start program, which is a program that supports under-resourced families. and supports their young children who are ages 4 in that pre-K age group. And I actually designed a very important space where our children and our families in Chinatown were able to talk about their culture freely. We made dioramas of our heritage, of our cultural identity, who's in our family. We made a community map of Chinatown. Kids drew pictures of what their houses look like, and then we decided to put it on a geographic map. We were learning like geography that way in our neighborhoods. I actually show them certain clips of like a PBS video of immigration, of transcontinental railroad, and then before that it was how the women's movement during the turn of the century was impacted by them being present as being laborers. So all of that can be done. It's not impossible. I think people are very afraid to talk about race because they see it as controversial, but really it's part of our identity as Americans. And also it's really important for our children to have a mirror, right? It's the mirror and windows sort of like metaphor, where you want your children to look at curriculum and be at school where they can learn and see themselves, but you also want them to learn about other people. So looking out in the window as well. So I'll throw it up to Khyati.
I think that the fear is absolutely there with early childhood educators because it's like, oh, am I going to say the wrong thing? I always think it's great to start with questions and asking the students kind of what they think. And storybooks are great, but not just reading to them, right? But asking questions like, so what do you see in the book? And that gets what's in their head out there, because kids are making these observations. And one of the most important things is if they say something and you're not sure what to say, to not shush them or sweep it under the rug. Am I using the right phrase? Sweep it under the rug. I mess up these phrases. You know me. You've worked with me. I mess them up all the time. But that's really, really critical. And if you're feeling a little nervous, that's okay. I think that's another thing that educators need to understand, and that, of course, you need the training. But it's almost, I think the three of you would agree, right? We're not always comfortable doing the things we're doing. There's discomfort, right? But it's about getting used to that.
Liza?
The only thing I'll just add is that, having worked in a K-8 school, I tend to notice that it's actually not the children that have the discomfort, it's the parents and caregivers. And so one of the strategies, I know that we have a couple of questions from K and pre-K teachers in grade 3, it's how do you also create a homeschool connection for this work? A lot of times we get a little bit of pushback from the home community because they're unsure what we're teaching. In particular, if the parents find that there isn't alignment between what I learned in 3rd grade and what they're learning in 3rd grade. So I think part of the job of the teacher in that space is to navigate the homeschool connection. To Khyati's point, send home, let them know the book that you're reading, send home some of the questions that you asked. And it also just helps to build the habits and skills within that family for difficult and courageous conversations.
And
Thank you.
I would just add, I agree with what LaRonda just said. Invite the students to share their thoughts and feelings, right? As particularly with what she says, they can teach us. They can teach us too. That is key. Right? So
can I just mention that it was very interesting. I want to tell a story about my student teacher today because I'm so proud of my student teachers because we've been talking about honoring our students' identities. And two of my students created a curriculum where they wanted to honor their students' identity, but also to talk about Atlanta shooting. And they were denied. They were denied by the administrator or the teacher, stating that this is not the time. Yet 95% of the students in Flushing are Chinese. right? So when is the time? When is ever the time? There is never a right time. So something we need to recognize as school leaders and teachers is that you have to stop shielding our students from information which they already know. You need to hold space for them. You need to honor who they are and their identities. If you don't know how to talk about it, let them at least express how they're feeling, right? Then at least you have a thermometer, kind of like a temperature check, what the climate is in your classroom and how your students are feeling. So I just wanted to like say that, because there are student teachers and young people in our school that want to do the work, but they're not always allowed, quote unquote, allowed to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And Judy, I want to go back to something I think you mentioned earlier in terms of, wanting to, the students already know, right? They're feeling it and they're waiting for us to open the door. They're waiting for us to acknowledge them. And so not allowing the teachers to do the work or have the conversation, the students are watching, the students are noticing, the students recognize what we don't say as much as what we do say. So, by not bringing in the conversation, they're taking a cue from us. They're taking a message from us. And all of you, each of you talked about that invisibility. That actually is counter to what we're trying to do. It's going to continue to render them, their experiences, invisible. They can't process it. We don't know what they're processing at home, and then they come to school or they're virtual, and especially in a virtual environment, and they're not processing it there either. You mentioned feelings, right? And you mentioned them being able to talk through their feelings. For our school and other schools I know use the ruler program and the mood meter, right? And so you put up the mood meter and ask students to name, how are you feeling? What is a feeling? Point to it or talk about it. Name it, right? Because it is there. Pretending like it's not there is not going to help our situation at all. And it's actually going to lead to something that is also coming up in our Q&A and our chats over here about bullying, right? And folks are asking, when do we talk about this? When do we teach this? How young is too young? How old do they have to be? We know that babies as young as 3 months, 6 months can already start to process difference. And then as they get older, that starts to manifest in behavior. You can't touch me, right? I can't play with you. I don't want to be around you. And then that can manifest the bullying behaviors on the playground and otherwise. So it behooves us not to do this and have these conversations earlier. So a couple of questions are asking about keeping an eye out for bullying or addressing bullying. And Khyati, what would you say? How do we start to address bullying around AAPI?
So I think there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. So first, let's start with the term racism for a minute, okay? And I really like to try to talk about racisms because Shanelle, you and I have had this conversation. You as a Black woman and me as an Asian American woman, we experience race and racism differently, right? In my first book, way back like many eons ago, is what it seems like now, I collected data on second generation Indian Americans. And I asked them about if they'd ever, I did interviews, qualitative study. And I asked folks, have you experienced any racism? And I can't tell you how many people actually said no. And then when I asked other questions about bullying, about other things, they would vividly describe experiences that were racist, but they didn't give it that term. Because one of the things that the data shows us is that for a lot of non-Black students who are folks of color, they define racism vis-a-vis the Black experience, right? And that's actually how many adults understand it also. So in terms of bullying, an Asian American student is going to be harassed maybe about their name. You're looking at it, somebody who lived through that, I went by, because of the way people would butcher my name. Some of y'all don't know this out there, but I went by Kathy. I never changed the name spelling. Thank goodness my parents wouldn't let me. And my mom, I had to hear from her all the time that if you can say their name, they can say yours. right? And then finally, when I was like 24, I went back to Khyati. I mean, all my Indian friends called me Khyati, my parents, my whole family. It was just at school because I couldn't take it. I couldn't take it anymore, right? So there's names, there's the things we eat, there's things we don't know. Those are the things that Asian American kids often get bullied for, especially if they're bringing their home food to school. And that's different than maybe what happens with other folks. So I think just asking the questions of, not straight up asking, so are you being bullied, right? Because most kids aren't going to answer that. But, questions about belonging, around belonging will get us the answers you're looking for to be able to take action.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And a number of people are chiming in about the importance of names and pronunciation of names. And so many names others can say. Why can't you say ours, right? Our names are so important. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to go back to, there's a question here, go back to something I think Liza mentioned earlier around just speaking truth, right? And telling the narrative, telling the whole story. Whose narrative are we telling? And yes, it gets uncomfortable. But how do you fill in the balance or gain the balance between telling that truth, right? And sometimes there are people who don't want to hear that truth, right? Or would challenge that truth. It could be those concerned parents and others. So what would you say to that, Liza?
Oh, you know I'm coming for this question. So I happened to see a peek at the question. There was a comment about like that DEI directors have too much power. And I'm just here to say, you'll give DEI directors way too much credit, because I have not been in a space where I had like super decision-making power. So I actually will highlight that as one thing, which is, yes, I'm seeing a lot of DEI directors or race folks get really scapegoated, and boo to your institution that's keeping you out there. Because I know it's not just you making a decision, it's an institutional decision, and you're getting named, and your leadership needs to stand up for you in these moments. Your leadership, your board of trustees, that is not a one-person decision to change curriculum at a school. So step one, y'all need to step up for the truth tellers. But the second part is, what's interesting about that word, Shanelle, balance. What exactly are we balancing? I'm so, right? Like, what is it that you're asking me to balance? A one-sided version of history with multiple perspectives? Like, is that what you want me to Not you, I know. But like, what are we balancing exactly? So what I'm asking is, we actually have to speak like complicated truth. Again, I started off my introduction, I do not identify as Native American or Indigenous. And as I listen to my Native American, Indigenous, First People scholars, friends, community members, the ways in which we, right, as settlers, colonizers, and I include our lineage in there, have come onto this land, and in many ways in our own education and policies have erased Native and Indigenous people in this work. I think about, even though we're highlighting Asian violence against the Asian American community, Indigenous people have been asking for visibility, and the violence and the missing and endangered women, like that is a conversation that's been happening in their communities as well. And so when I think about what is exactly are we trying to balance, right? That's the question I put back on schools. What exactly are you trying to even out? I also want to really push back against this piece around civility. So in the past couple of weeks and months and years, we've been calling for civility. And I want to be very clear, civility is the burden of those marginalized, right? I have only heard people say, you need to be more civil, or you need to be a team player. Or I was actually told by a school administrator, Liza, you need to smile more when you deliver those kind of speeches, because it kind of rubs white people the wrong way. And so as we think about like, what are the messages that we're even given about truth telling? And when I was a kid and as I was growing up, if you lied in school, you got punished. And now what we're saying as educators and administrators is, oh no, we don't want to hear that truth. That truth's too difficult. So I go back to these two pieces. We have to build the habits and skills of hearing actual truth in this country and teaching it. So for the folks, and again, my heart goes out to the many schools and my chosen family who are getting named in a lot of these articles about we are just kind of pushing a particular type of agenda. I'm here to encourage you. What you're doing is truth telling. And if that's the message we're giving children, tell the truth, speak truth, then thank you for taking on that brave space as well. And I beg of your institutions to continue to support you in this work. There is no such thing as balance.
Thank you so much for that. Judy and Khyati?
Go ahead, Judy.
I also think a lot of the truth telling, and I want to thank Liza for giving that passionate talk to us, because it is a really true reminder that we need to be fearless, because lives are being lost on the daily right now. This is evidence of violence in America. And it's not even about January 6th, because that January 6th has already been bubbling up for a very long time, right? I think the fear of not truth telling is protection of privilege, because privilege feels good, right? Privilege feels safe, but privilege is helping those who have means, who are citizens, who are majority white, who have, who have systems to protect you. It doesn't protect me and my children. It doesn't protect students of color that I work with. And eventually it's not going to protect you either, because we are growing. We're 23 million strong. Asian Americans are growing with, minority over majority. That's going to happen. We're not here to take over America, though I think that's the fear that is emulating around this conversation, is because they are afraid that people of color are going to take over the world. I know there's a comfort for people to see, for instance, working class Asian women as people who will serve you, right? Who are objects, who's going to clean your feet and push the dim sum cart, or whatever you imagine Asian women to be. But you know what? We're changing the narratives, because we are a diverse group of people. And I think sharing the power is so scary for people that they don't want ethnic studies. They don't want women's studies. They don't want any of those studies, because it's upholding white supremacy. And we need to name it. We need to be very honest. We need to name it. Okay. And we need to say, this is what white supremacy looks like. And it is hurting all our children. When I talk about race issues with my students who actually are also white, my students feel bad. They're like, I feel bad about my family. I feel bad about my neighborhood. And I told Matthew, one of my students, I'm like, don't feel bad. It's not your fault. It's the system's fault, because you have been taught about your privilege. It's you're taught to be a racist, and it's not your fault, right? So for all of us to be in this room is that we do have to change the system, the educational system. We have to change the way we teach. We have to change the way we do professional development, and we have to be courageous about doing it. Khyati?
I would say also that while we need to continue to identify and name white supremacy, as Judy very passionately stated, we also need to, in our Asian American communities, continue conversations that I know have really kind of started and I've been continuing on the anti-Black racism that exists in our own communities, right? That's really, really important. That has gotten in the way of building coalition, of getting to know African-American folks in our lives. And that's got to be part of this truth telling, And I think that, when after January 6th happened, there was immediately the call for like reconciliation, right? Truth comes first. Then we work towards justice, because now we have truth. We work towards justice. Then we can start talking about reconciliation, right? So it's got to be that flow, because otherwise it's flawed. It is absolutely flawed. So I'll stop there.
It's got to be that flow, otherwise it's absolutely flawed, right? Thank you to each of the three of you. And Liza, I am reminded of one of your recent Facebook posts about, there's an image or meme or whatever it is we call it going around of, stop Asian hate with the X through that, and, the line and, stop white supremacy. And you really stress and. It's an and, right? Not one or the other, but really examining both. You can't do one without the other. So thank you for bringing that to light. Thank you all for sharing. And, as we begin to close this evening, and I see a number of other comments coming in, wanted to put up a couple of resources for you. Each of these people here are a resource to us for sure. And we invite those of you who can to join us this summer for the Institute for Teaching Diversity and Social Justice, of which Dr. Liza Talusan will be joining us in July for design and implementation. But certainly you can also go to our website at idsj.us and sign up for additional resources, sign up for our newsletter. And Khyati has also put together a resource list of books and other types of resources to be shared out as well. Many of you have asked this evening about, what can I do? What can I read? How can I start to change my curricula? And so here are some examples, just some. And I saw a number of other comments in the chat about Google and the importance of doing our own research as well. And so, the research is there, the resources are there, the materials are there. And I encourage everyone to reach out and find that. Khyati?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Judy shared a resource today that we will make sure to include in the next newsletter. And we'll give a shout out to her. So, do sign up, and then that will be forthcoming on Judy. It's with children's books. Am I right?
Yes, we need diverse books. Hashtag we need diverse books. They're a wonderful resource. There are a lot of, organizations. If you're on Twitter, there's a lot of information that you can find on your own. I also just want to make a brief comment about Asian and Black solidarity. We are organizing. I don't want us to leave the space to think that we're not organizing. Last week, I organized with my colleague, Dr. Yolanda Suli Ruiz at Teachers College with another educator, Michael Cho at Teachers College, where we were very much inspired by Jose Antonio Vargas, Define Americans organization on the Black and Gold Forum. We did that for education. And it was a powerful place where we also had similar, talk about the historic divide between Asian and Black communities, but that was on purpose. So there's a reason why we're divided. And I really encourage all of you to really understand that historic piece, because it is by design. So the more we are like this is because it was created like that on purpose to keep us apart and to keep us fighting from each other. So I think it's important to think about, and there's a lot of young people in New York City's Chinatown. We had a few protests, and my students were part of it. They've been sharing pictures with us. There is love there. I don't want us to leave the space by feeling like the world is filled with hate, because it isn't. Love always wins. And I think it's important for us to be reminded of that, to look at our young people, to look at our children, because they deserve better. And we need to do that with them, not just for them. We need to do it with them.
Yeah. With them, not just for them. Thank you. And that, leads me to our closing. And I wanted to share this quote with you all, with everyone this evening, a quote that has sat with me and resonated with me from Kathleen Asta at the National Equity Project. And it says, "We have an extraordinary opportunity at this moment in human history to pause and to feel our human connectedness, and to consider how we might respond to both the suffering and the possibility of the moment in ways that create communities of belonging and care." So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to Khyati, Liza, and Judy. Here are our social media handles, if you will, many ways to reach us, many ways to remain connected, many ways to stay engaged in the conversation, and I hope you will. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening.
And I just want to add real quick before we sign off, a shout out to our IDSJ alums. I know you're out there and you know the love that Judy was talking about. We feel it for y'all. We know you feel it for us. And super, super happy about, we really missed not doing IDSJ last summer, and we're looking forward this year. We are already half full on both institutes, so we're excited. So if you're going to attend, sign up. And I will be, on the comments later on, but thank you so much for everybody taking the time to join. And particular thanks to Judy and Liza. In light of what happened in Atlanta, they have been going almost 24/7, and it takes a toll. It takes a toll. So really, really special thanks. Thank you. And always, Shanelle's always fun. Bye, everybody.